Hey guys, Ramsey here. Welcome to another video. Today we have a review of one of my favorite houses of all time. You guys know I have been on an Amouage kick. I want to review every single Amouage in my collection, and I am well on my way to doing that. Today is a very special Amouage because it's one of the last releases of Christopher Chong's reign at Amouage before he had to abdicate the throne and allow the evil Raymond Salmon to take over. And anyways, we won't go down the fairy tale route, but you know how much of a Christopher Chong fanboy that I am. I absolutely love his work in his days at Amouage. And what's funny is, this was a fragrance that I actually did not like at first. And this is called Amouage Portrayal Man. And just let's take a moment, if we can, to just admire what I think is probably one of the most beautiful bottles in my collection. I mean, for me, this bottle is an absolute work of art. There's a similarity to the Fate bottle, which they did in 2013, I believe, with this oil, almost like an oil spill glossiness over the front of the bottle. It actually looks better in person than it does even picking up here. But with the gunmetal cap and a little bit of a twist, the gunmetal emblem, I mean, I'm not big on packaging or anything like that, but these are just some of my all-time favorite bottles of all time. I love how they were able to remain classy and yet stick to the Amouage theme, if you will. So here's the box. Again, not big on packaging. In fact, I hated this packaging originally, but I ended up coming around to it, and I'll kind of explain why as we go on to the review. But as usual, you have the sort of Gift of Kings crest up here. This is a made in the UK bottle, which I bought this as soon as it came out in 2019. This was when I was just blind buying whatever Amouage came out. I bought this, and Portrayal was made in the UK. So my bottle was actually made in the UK, which is funny because back in the day, people were like, I don't want any made in the UK bottle. I only want made in Oman. Now that they shut down the UK branch, if you will, the factory in the United Kingdom, now people are like, now it's turning into a collector's item. Now they're like, I want made in UK because they don't make it anymore. That's just how it goes for frag heads. So Portrayal is a special review for me, and I'll tell you why. When I bought this, I was disappointed, okay? I didn't hate it, but I was like, what the fuck is this? This is not an Amouage, you know what I mean? Smelling this, I was let down, let's put it that way. And I do this with my food sometimes as well. If I have something on my plate that I don't like, I was like, I'm just going to eat it as fast as I can and get it off of my plate, right? And so I started to do that with Portrayal. So I wore the piss out of Portrayal. In 2019, going into 2020, I remember wearing this a lot right before they ended up sending us home for COVID lockdowns. And so look at the dent that I've put in this since 2019. That's a hell of a dent for a collection my size. And I wore this and wore it, and I was like, you know what, I'm just going to wear this whole damn bottle just to be done with the damn thing because I hate it. And a crazy thing happened. As the more that I wore it, the more I understood it, the more I fell in love with it. And you know what? This is one of the few fragrances that many times, because of my experience, and of course, 2019, 2020, I wasn't as experienced as I am now in 2024. But even back then, a lot of times I felt like I could spray a fragrance and within one or two wears, understand it. And sometimes that's how I review my early impression fragrances. You know, if I have a little decant or sample, I'll give my thoughts and move on, may never smell it again, right? This is one of those fragrances that proved to me that this truly is all subjective. Everything we do here talking about, this is for the passion and the love. This is a subjective hobby, obviously. That goes without saying. But this is one of those fragrances where my opinion shifted on it greatly as the years went on, as I continued to wear it. So let's talk about the idea behind this in 2019. This is a fragrance where a trend was beginning in the industry in 2019. For whatever reason, thank God it's a trend that I think has pretty much died. But back in 2018, 19, we started to see especially some of these niche houses only give us like 2 or 3 notes in the note breakdown. And I hated that trend. So when Amouage put this out, they released it as having violet leaf in the top, vetiver in the heart, and cade or cade oil or cade juniper in the base. They all basically mean the same thing. Some people see the cade juniper and they think it's juniper berries. It's not. Cade oil is different. Cade juniper, cade oil, however you want to describe it, is different from the juniper berries that you'll a lot of times get in top notes, right? And so cade smells more closely reminiscent to something like birch tar. It has like a leathery smokiness to it, okay? So those are the only 3 notes Amouage gave us. And I'll read you the little blurb, which, by the way, the new Amouage website is an absolute travesty. The blurb that they have on this, on the Amouage website, and this is the only blurb that's on here, by the way. So here's what it says. It's 1 sentence. They have 1 freaking sentence on this fragrance. It says, an olfactive portrayal of the 1920s bohemian culture. This woody and leather fragrance exudes an air of exquisite audacity. That's it. Like, that's all you have to say about the fragrance. That's all. So obviously this is the old packaging. It doesn't come in this packaging anymore. It comes in the new Amouage packaging, which I also hate. But we're not going to get on a hate rant here, but I will read you. I was able to find the original blurb, so I'm going to try to read that to you here. So here is what the original Amouage blurb basically when it came out. The 5th chapter of the 2nd cycle of the Amouage narrative by creative director Christopher Chong. Portrayal is a manifestation of a person's orientation to him or herself, a reflection of his or her unique authenticity. It is about breaking free from the cages of solitude society sets around people because their truths are often seen as shockingly unconventional. Portrayal embodies an artist's ability to reconnect fragments from different times and places. See, they said fragments. I was thinking figments, which this is getting a full review from me very soon as well, with a beautiful bottle, and my favorite Anique Minardo of all time, by the way. Fragments from different times and places. When society is barren, they are able to transport themselves and immerse in the freedom of rebellion that can be compared to London's roaring 20s and New York's grooving 1980s. And the 80s theme will come up in this fragrance. With the flamboyant, glamorous, and often disaffected companionship of bright young people, the artists lose themselves, desperately seeking something to fill the void. They synergize with art, culture, and themselves in order to recreate something infinitely indefinable. And this is a quote from Christopher Chong. A person who dares to defy the norms of their society, portrayal is for the bold. I agree with that, and I also disagree with it, but we'll talk about it as the review goes on. It is inspired by times of dramatic social change and the people who pushed beyond the limits of mass culture during their times. It is a reflection man is what came to mind when I heard that, of the birth of a new age and the freedoms that come with it. Portrayal is an olfactive description of the 1920s bohemian culture. There's the line that Amouage currently has on the website. Its woody and leather aroma exudes an air of exquisite audacity. It is about the arrogance and social tension in the world's cultural discourse. With vetiver at its heart and top notes of violet leaves, Portrayal Man emits a dandy yet masculine impression. Its light, spicy facets enriches its woody base of Cade, allowing the fragrance to illustrate an enlightening energy that is unforgivable. Amouage's signature glass crystal bottles are introduced in an iridescent pearl finish. That's what they call this, an iridescent pearl finish, which I absolutely love. This is right at the end of the times they were putting the names on the side of the bottle. And it's one of Christopher Chong's last releases in 2019. It's not technically his last, but it's one of his last, okay? It's an eau de parfum, and I think the current price now is like $360 for 100 mils. Yeah, $360 for 100 mils. They call it an amber woody on Amouage's website, which I completely disagree with, again, but we won't go there. So let's talk about the scent. So again, a perfect example of why you cannot judge a book by its cover, or you cannot judge a fragrance by its note listing. And to be honest, I hated this fragrance at first. I disliked it intently, not because I thought it was a bad fragrance, but because I was like, this is not an Amouage. Like, it's just not. You know, you have a certain expectation from Amouage, and my head kept trying to wrap around what in the world is Christopher Chong trying to do? And think, this is a man who loves 80s perfume, because if you know anything about fragrances, and you know anything about violet leaf, you know that there are some Hall of Fame, let's say, violet leaf fragrances that came out in the 70s and 80s. In the 1970s, we had stuff like Gray Flannel, which is totally underrated. This is completely, I would say, overlooked by the young crowd, but probably to me, Gray Flannel shares the most with Portrayal, even though it's always compared to the 80s Fahrenheit. Because the gasoline accord is amped up in Portrayal Man. Portrayal Man has a sort of vintage Fahrenheit gasoline-like hit. It's got that hardcore petrol hit that Fahrenheit heads loved, okay? But I think because of the green vetiver and all this other stuff, which we'll talk about as the review goes on, it is much more closely related to gray flannel, in my personal opinion, okay? But both of these fragrances have violet leaf, okay? They have that sort of, they call it an ozonic violet leaf, but it definitely opens up with that old school blast of violet leaf, which you're not going to get away from that homage to the 80s. And so as someone who loved the 80s, when I first smelled this, I was like, okay, so what is Amouage doing? I just didn't understand it. You know, I love 80s fragrances. I have Fahrenheit. I don't need another Fahrenheit is kind of what I was thinking. And so I was going, what in the world is going on? And so slowly, okay, the fragrance begins to unravel itself. And I say slowly purposely because this fragrance takes its time, all right? This fragrance does not in a rush. There are all these multiple points along the dry down where the fragrance smells different continuously until it reaches its full dry down late into its life cycle. So you're going to get this hardcore blast basically in the opening of this smoky, leathery, earthy woodiness mixed with that petrol feel. And the petrol feel is hardcore. I mean, to me, I think it's a very well done gasoline accord. So I used to tell people, hey, if you don't like the gasoline accord in the new Fahrenheit bottles, which I actually think are quite good, but if you're like, man, you know, old Fahrenheit is the best, it's and nothing will ever replace it, I was telling people, check out Portrayal Man. They did an amazing job with that petrol gasoline opening, but they did it in Amouage's style. And this is where I think the pieces of the puzzle began to reveal itself to me. My father used to always tell me when I was a kid, every problem has a very simple answer. You know, if it's covered by a sheet of paper, all you have to do is blow the paper and you'll see the answer underneath. But we as humans, of course, get frustrated and, you know, sometimes we make things much harder than they have to be. And I wore this out of anger, let's say, for years, honestly. It probably honestly took me years to fully wrap my head around what Portrayal Man was and come to love it, right? And so that's why it is kind of funny we get on here on YouTube and we talk about fragrances because we love it. But sometimes, you know, our first initial impression of a fragrance is just wrong, or it's just not the way that you're going to feel later on as time goes on. If I would have done an early impression or a first impression off of a sample of this, I probably would have bashed it, right? So take that with a grain of salt. Make of that statement what you will, right? But it's expertly blended, and along with that gasoline, like you spilled petrol on your hands and you're gonna wipe it on your jeans kind of feeling, you get the note of cade oil, like I talked about earlier, which is different from from juniper berries. The cade juniper feels much more smoky, leathery, earthy. It adds this damp outdoor element to it. And I think there's a lot of other notes that are not listed in here. Number one is patchouli. I am 1000% convinced there's patchouli in here. I don't think you could create this without patchouli. I just think it's part of the composition. I also think there's sandalwood in here. I think patchouli and sandalwood are two of the biggest notes that are missing. And it ends up turning into, as the fragrance begins to move towards its dry down, you're going to notice this is about a 1 hour spray here. I've got about a 12-hour dry down here, okay? So you're going to notice as it goes further in its progression that more and more of that vetiver begins to take control, right? And so what's interesting is the vetiver will ultimately almost turn into the dominant note, right? Vetiver is a very long-lasting material, and many fragrances use vetiver in the base because vetiver is one of those materials that lasts a long time on your skin. And here you notice that it's in the heart of the fragrance. So very interesting. The cade's in the base, but the vetiver's in the heart. But you will begin to get more and more of that sort of green vetiver. It turns into the dominant note late into the dry down. And, you know, it's important to mention that there are other notes that are not listed in this composition as well, to me. And I think when you first spray the fragrance, along with that petrol vibe, if you really pay attention, if you give it some wears, 5-10 wears in, you're going to notice the spiciness that really begins to show itself, okay? And I don't want you to be put off by this, but I think that spiciness is a mix of cumin and nutmeg. It shouldn't put you off as well. I think this is a very professional. They say, I've heard it referred to as an austere fragrance, a very austere fragrance, okay? And I think that is a good word for it. I wore this to work today. Perfect for the office. For me, this is a perfect office fragrance because it's just daring enough to show I'm not a NPC drone, right? I'm my own person, but it is sort of traditionally masculine enough that it's the kind of image that I want to portray myself to somebody else, right? If I walk by someone in the hall and they smell this on me, they kind of know a little bit about me without ever even saying a word to me, right? That's a perfect office fragrance to me, and this does that. And so it's interesting because there's just a touch of cumin and nutmeg in the top, I think, to give it a little bit of this spiciness, a little bit of this Amouage twist. It differentiates it a little bit from Fahrenheit. I don't want you to think about the cumin in Fate Man. I think that, you know, I'll review this. This is one of the 2 review Amouages. You can see I put a pretty fairly sized dent in Fate Man as well. But, you know, the cumin in Fate Man is just like a cumin bomb. Here, it's so, I would say, quietly dosed, where you're going to start picking it up the more you wear it, all right? So for the first half hour or so, you'll probably get some of those spices. Heavier earlier on into the first of that half hour. So the first 5, 10, 15 minutes are the majority of the spices that you'll smell. But it will last into the dry down a little way. Sorry, I've been working all day. It's 7 o'clock at night, and I basically was up at 5:45 to start the day. So it's been a long day for the Ram. But it's going to take you some time to sort of wrap your head around this composition and pick out all of these little details. And I feel like for me, there's different schools of thought on this fragrance. This is a very complex fragrance. In FragCom, there's a lot of, I would say, disagreements on Portrayal Man. But for me, I think the thing that really set me off in that it was hard for me to wrap my head around it is there's a couple things going on with that violet leaf when you first spray, okay? And what you're going to get are a couple notes that really, I think, make up the artwork of the scent. So when you see this box, right? When I saw this box, I was like, man, this is the most boring Amouage. Like, you think about the interlude boxes, the Imitation Man, all of these other boxes, and they all were much more out there. This was, I would say, a simpler box for an Amouage, and I didn't really like it. I didn't understand it. But I will tell you that the more I wore it and the more I picked up, there's 2 notes that I think make up the feeling of this box in the perfume. One is musk. And there's this cloudy musk-like feel in here that feels very airy. And what's interesting is obviously when you smell violet leaf, many people compare violet leaf, they call it ozonic, that it has this ozonic feel. Well, when we think about the ozone, we think about air, right? So obviously I'm saying cloudy musk. It could be a mixture of some sort of musky material. I think somebody mentioned that in Jubilation 25, there's a musky material called galaxolide, or I'm like I said, I'm not a perfumer, so don't hold my pronunciation of that. Don't hold my feet to the fire on it. And I don't even know if it is this particular material, but I'm just saying there's something in here that's giving it a little bit of this cloudy, airy muskiness and powderiness. And the powderiness, first thing a lot of people think of is iris. And I think that there is definitely a mixture of iris, but earthy smelling iris, like an earthy sort of muskiness. And so along with that, you get this almost ozonic freshness, all right? So yes, it's dirty. Yes, it's got the hardcore violet leaf, you know, petrol opening of masculines gone by. They said the 1920s. I can't think of any 20 fragrances that would compare to this, but definitely, let's say the 70s and the 80s. It has that. But on the other side, it's got a little bit of the spices and it has that muskiness, all right? That's not listed. There's no musks, there's no iris listed, but I would bet those 4 notes that I mentioned are in the composition. And Pierre Negrin, you know, he has done interviews where he's talked about the scent, and I know that he's mentioned there are multiple things that are not listed in the note listing because the interviewer, I think, really kind of held his feet to the fire and said, come on, 3 notes? And he was like, yes, of course, there's other things. And those are my 4 guesses: patchouli, sandalwood, musks, and some sort of iris or orris root or whatever you want to call it, right? And so the box is really, even though I hated the box at first, the box is actually a perfect representation because it almost looks like you're kind of falling down this, or instead of falling down, you're floating up into the clouds, right? And at the center, there's this vortex. And so look at all the details on each one of these, right? And it almost looks like you could just get lost in each one of these details. And that's how the fragrance actually ends up wearing. It's a perfect representation of that creamy muskiness, but also the depth of the fragrance that feels very simple at first. So when you first sort of wear it, you're probably thinking, I've smelled this type of DNA before. Why would Amouage do this? But the more you wear it, the more you realize the details and, you know, the signature of Christopher Chong's work. It's all here. And it's got an amazing perfumer. I love Pierre Guerlain. I think he's one of the most underrated perfumers. Like I said, now I understand it. And I think it's one of the great parting gifts that Christopher Chong gave us, along with, of course, Overture Man and Overture Woman, which I have reviews of both of these on the channel, by the way, if you're interested in learning about some of his later Amouage releases. And slowly, what ends up happening is that gasoline, petrol vibe, which is so in your face. It's almost humorous at the beginning because it's like, bam, 80s masculine fragrance in your face. They don't even try to hide it. It begins to dry down. And interestingly enough, once that petrol, hardcore spiciness dries down and it sort of loses this tightly wrapped ball that it's in, you begin to smell around the outskirts florals, okay? And what's so interesting about this for me is the outline of that petrol note. It creates this floral-like smell. And so as the hours tick by and that petrol, you know, I call it a tightly wound ball, but let's say it begins to lose its synergies and you begin to smell what sort of made up that, let's say, tight, and look at the Amouage logo in the middle, right? Let's say what makes that logo stay, right, in a circular, in a tightly wound ball is the florals. It really does feel like there are a ton of other florals in here creating that accord. And the reason I've come to that conclusion is if you take Fahrenheit, Fahrenheit has that petrol-like vibe. And if you look at Fahrenheit, though, many people sort of give Fahrenheit props for 2 things. The gasoline accord in the top, which obviously is beautiful, I love it, and the base of leather. The leather in the base, the gasoline in the top. But there's a whole huge floral heart in Fahrenheit, right? And it's made up of all kind of florals: hawthorn, honeysuckle, carnation, jasmine, lily of the valley, chamomile, and probably some violety materials. A perfumer once told me that the difference between violet leaf and this violety materials are sometimes they kind of blend, right? Sometimes the streams get crossed, if you will. And so this large floral creation, I smell it in Portrayal Man. And there's something obviously of a leathery dry down as well in Portrayal Man, but it stays much greener. You know, it turns much more like you're, you know, actually standing in rolling hills. If you've ever heard me describe gray flannel, I've never done a full review, but if you ever heard me talk about it in passing and stuff like that, gray flannel always gives me these rolling hills, almost like the image that they try to give you for green Irish tweed. That's what I get when I smell gray flannel. And there's a little bit of that in Portrayal Man as well. And so I would argue, because of the influence of the vetiver, sorry, my computer locked here. Let me unlock it. So because of the influence of the vetiver in Portrayal Man, I think that the violet leaf accord even smells more natural in Portrayal Man than it does on some of these other vintage masculine fragrances that I'm talking about. And I actually have, let me grab a blotter. 1 second, don't go anywhere. Uno momento. So I'm gonna grab a Riz Ladore blotter because Russian Adam actually sent me some violet leaf absolute. Look at the color of that of the Violet Leaf Absolute. Let me just put a tiny bit in here. It's been a while since I've done this, but you know, it's so green. That's the thing. Look how thick that is. That's the Absolute of Violet Leaf. Oh wow. I mean, it doesn't smell anything like any of the Violet Leaf accords that you would smell. Like if you expect that gasoline ozonic opening in Fahrenheit to smell like this, it's not. Actual Violet Leaf Absolute, it's so much more greener. You know, it's like blending violet with the stem of the flower and the leaves and all the grassy earthiness that's around it. You know what I mean? It's like a green blend. You know, it's like you stuck grass and weeds and dandelions and all of this stuff in a blender and just blended it up. And that's kind of what the Violet Leaf Absolute smells like. So it's interesting because I really do feel like because of the influence of the vetiver, the green notes, this actually leans more to what you would expect a proper Violet Leaf note to smell like. And, you know, like I said, this fragrance has a very long, drawn-out journey to get to where it's supposed to be. It's almost like the fragrance is filibustering you. Like, it's going to force you to like it, whether you like it or not. It's gonna continue to talk, if you will, until you just surrender to its to what it's trying to say. And it does take a long time to get to its full dry down. I've tried to measure when I think that moment stops over the years, and it's really hard to do. I think I've kind of settled on 6 to 7 hours. I think this fragrance really reaches its full dry down somewhere around 6 to 7 hours, that you basically went through the life of the scent, and then it really goes into the base. But this fragrance does last on my skin. I mean, this is 12 hours, and I can still smell it from work this morning. It's very, very faint, but I can still smell it. Probably more like 10. I'd probably say it lasts 10 plus hours on my skin. But to get to the full dry down, 6 to 7 hours. And it's constantly changing. Hour 3, hour 4. It's very, very complex fragrance to me. Now, the elephant in the room. Something that many people talk about in, let's say, FragCom, and a debate, if you will, between different opposing views, right? It's almost like two lawyers debating on how a law should be interpreted, right? So here is the elephant in the room. There are some folks who think that there is a boozy note inside of Portrayal, and there are some folks that have taken that and absolutely ran with it, that this is a boozy fragrance. I've heard people say that there's gin in this fragrance. I've heard people say that there's cognac in this fragrance. And interestingly enough, this came out in 2019. This came out in 2019. It was a Harrods exclusive at first, but I think came out around the end of 2019. This was early 2019, if memory serves. This was the end of 2019. But, you know, Overture Man has a cognac note. You can go check out my full review if you want to. God, the color of that juice, though, man. Beautiful. If you want to learn more about Overture Man, you can go check out my full review. But the kind of the thinking goes that Overture Man, that they had cognac notes created on hand, basically, to use in Overture, so they also might as well use it in Portrayal Man. And it's an interesting thought process, let's say. I think I fall on the side that there is no proper boozy note in Portrayal Man. I think it's just that the vetiver comes off as boozy. I think sometimes vetiver, I've heard people call vetiver all kinds of things. I've heard them call it swampy or you know, earthy or inky, or, you know, there's different types of vetiver, obviously. But this vetiver, for some reason, I think it just comes off as slightly boozy, if that makes sense. And so it smells like a boozy vetiver fragrance. Now, I'm going to review a proper boozy vetiver fragrance here in the future called Guerlain Homme. This is the Eau de Parfum. They used to call it Eau de Parfum Intense. They no longer call it Eau de Parfum Intense. Now it's just called Guerlain Homme Eau de Parfum. It's basically the exact same thing. But Guerlain Homme Eau de Parfum is basically a vetiver fragrance that has a mojito-like smell. So if you know of the mojito drink, you know, with that minty alcohol vibe, it's here with vetiver. And so I don't think Portrayal Man goes to that length of a proper, you know, boozy vetiver with proper booze, but I think the vetiver note itself just comes across as boozy, like it's in the background, like there is a boozy note in the background, but not enough to list it as an actual note is the way that I would sort of describe it. So I think that this is an amazing fragrance that captured my heart, completely did a 180 is kind of where I'm going with this, from something that I was actually pissed off that I bought at first. You know, I was like, why would Amouage release something like this, now to something that I love? And I consider this to be, in my opinion, one of the most interesting takes on vetiver I've ever smelled. And of course, if you're a fan of masculine perfumery from the past, if you're kind of one of those people that, like me, loves vintage fragrances, Portrayal Man is definitely one that you should put on your to sniff list, in my opinion. It will remind you of vintage fragrances from the past with that Amouage twist. And every time I wear it, I pick up different things. Even now, it's crazy. And you can see the dent I've put in this out of wearing it out of anger for so long. And now, of course, everywhere I'm looking forward to it. I love wearing Portrayal Man. It fits perfectly. Especially here in Texas. Like, it's going to be 70 degrees tomorrow in February here in Texas. That is perfect for this weather. 50s to 70s, absolutely perfect to me. So, yes, I think another gem by Christopher Chong. Very sorry to see his days at Amouage end. In fact, I would go so far as to say Amouage should, in honor of Sultan Bin Qaboos's memory, that they should get rid of Raymond Salman and rehire Christopher Chong. They should just admit their failure, right? And just go back to Christopher Chong to fix the harm that has been done to Amouage. That's how far I would go with the mistake. And I like the Fishman. From what I've heard him talk, I think he's a nice guy. I just don't think he's the right person for Amouage. And I know they're going for profits and all this stuff, but I think he is destroying one of the best legacies of a niche house. And I understand for us, we're like the fringe. We're like maybe the 0.01% of the population. They're trying to market to the next generation. Their new fragrance is called Love Delight. Love Delight. I mean, I don't think you could get any more cheesy or corny or unimaginative if you tried. Love Delight. It's just almost barf-inducing. And the color of the bottle and everything, I'm not a fan of what Amouage is doing. So this fragrance is a little bit of like a sad moment for me because it's coming down to the end of Christopher Chong's career and at Amouage. So yes, I mean, just a special fragrance for me, a fragrance that really taught me that you're always learning when you're smelling fragrances. That's one of the things I love about this hobby. Even if you know thousands of fragrances like I do, even if you've smelled so many fragrances and you have a huge collection and all this stuff, you can't wear everything all the time. So it's easy to reach on that back shelf, pick something that I haven't worn in a long time, spray it, and get different aspects of it. You know what I mean? That's one of the beauties of this hobby, is constantly learning, constantly exploring. And, you know, Portrayal Man really taught me an important lesson in this hobby. So I will always cherish this bottle and the memories that I have with it. Have some amazing memories wearing this fragrance. So again, thank you to Christopher Chong and Pierre Negrin for creating this beauty. And thank you for watching and commenting. I can't believe how close we are to 7,000 subscribers. I think I want to do something amazing for 7,000 subscribers. But it was something I think I was going to wait until we got to 10,000, but I think I'm going to do it for 7 because you know, who knows what tomorrow brings, right? It was like one of the reasons I was reviewing some of these fragrances from the decants up here is because I was like, you know what? I'm going to be able to get to my bottles anytime, but you never know what can happen in life. So I want to review my favorite fragrances. I want to review the full bottles, and you know, it's something that I don't want to have any regrets, right? So I'm going to run the channel this way going forward. And so I think we're going to have an amazing 7,000 subscriber celebration. I just have to find time to set everything up because it's a lot of work. So I appreciate every single one of you who is always here interacting, chatting with me. I try to make myself as available as possible. If you write me, most likely you will get a response. You know, we are growing fast, but we're still small enough where I can respond to each and every one of you. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining me on our little journey. As always, cheers, guys, and I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.